So, James, your research paper dives also into the occurrence of plateauing. How can people understand this word plateauing?
That's an interesting question. So when we think of a plateau, we think of there being some increase and then some kind of leveling off of what's happening. And so when we think of strength, which is what we obviously looked at in the fit20 study, we're talking about the idea that initially, when you start training, strength starts to increase. And then at some point, it starts to slowly kind of plateau out. And instead of continuing to increase over time, which it still does, but the increases become smaller and smaller over time. So it starts to look like it's plateauing. And you enter more of what we might call a kind of maintenance phase where the strength that you've gained is not being added to, but it's also not being lost over time. Instead, it's staying nice and steady and flat. And so all of those initial gains that you made, you're able to continue to maintain over time. And so when we talk about a plateau, that's what we're talking about, that kind of initial growth and then maintenance. And it's something that actually is, as much as people would prefer it if things kept just going up in a linear fashion, um, it's a pretty robust physiological phenomenon. We're all, as much as we don't want to admit it, we're all fairly aware that there is some ceiling to what we're able to achieve. And we can always produce some initial improvement and push us up towards what our kind of our maximum limit is. But once you get there, there's always going to be some ceiling. And it then becomes a game of longevity and how long can you maintain those gains for? And that's what I think is the really interesting finding from this is that we see, although there is a robust kind of plateau phenomenon, the more interesting thing is that it doesn't start to decline over the time period that we were looking at things, particularly in the older adults, where actually over the time period of the study, if they weren't training, we would have expected to see a loss over that time period, but we still see that maintenance over time. Um, and this is, like I say, it's pretty robust. It happens with any kind of training. There's no magic bullet that's going to suddenly break through and bust that plateau, like people refer to in the magazines and on Instagram and whatnot. Unfortunately, it's just a fact of life, and it doesn't really matter what training you're doing. You'll eventually hit that plateau, and then it becomes a game of maintenance, which in and of itself is progress. Really, when you think that given sufficient time, you'll start to lose that strength.
Yeah, yeah. What you say very important that people they lose strength if they weren't doing something to maintain it. Also, I saw already in one of the interviews or in one of the magazines the paper, and then people gain significant strength, comma initially, a bit as a as a disclaimer, like well, other ways of strengthening would possibly gain, or people would be able to gain more. But can you say something about that?
Yeah, and I mean, headlines are headlines. They try to be antagonistic, but I mean, there's some truth to that in terms of we don't actually have much in the way of similar data to compare it to looking at other training approaches. So it does remain possible that maybe some other training approach might enable that plateau to occur maybe later or adding something could break it. But I think that's highly unlikely. And we do have some other evidence that leads me to think that this is just a robust phenomenon that happens irrespective of what you're doing. And actually, what we did alongside looking at the fit20 study was we took a sample from a large open data set of powerlifters. And now we know powerlifters train in a very different way to how fit20 members train. Powerlifters typically train more frequently, and they use varying different loads. They do what's called periodization, which is to say that they vary their training over time, focusing on certain elements of their training. And there have been a lot of arguments that plateaus occur because you don't vary the stimulus over time. And so the powerlifters present a really interesting population to look at to see, well, these guys are varying their stimulus over time. And so it would be interesting to see whether they continue to make gains over time in terms of their strength and performance. But what we actually found was that they too also in short time hit a plateau and don't improve much after that. Instead, what we see is most powerlifters are probably well trained to begin with. So if you think about that initial strength gains that you make from just general resistance training, you'll hit that plateau eventually. And then maybe someone might decide, I want to start doing powerlifting. But most of those sorts of people are probably already on this plateau. They then start powerlifting and they start training the specific skill of doing the power lifts, which involves strength, of course, but there's a skill element to it as well. And what we see is there's maybe a little improvement specifically because they're training that, but then again, it very quickly plateaus. And it really suggests to me that given sufficient time, again, all roads will lead to Rome if you're engaging in that behavior consistently and you're following some simple principles, which is to say, primarily the intensity of effort is probably the most important factor, and that you're maintaining it for the long term.
Terrific. Good. Thanks for the clarification, James.